To them, African Americans and slavery are the only subjects they are interested in because it helps create an oppressed proletariat which they desperately need in order to push America into Marxist socialism, especially according to Antonio Gramsci, and which was noticed by Manning Johnson in the 1930s. Why? First, it is the basis for their incessant whining about racism despite history showing hundreds of thousands of white people suffered the loss of life, limb, and property in a civil war to finally set them free in America after decades of trying legislation and political compromises that didn't work, chiefly because of Democrat opposition. By the way, since the New York Times is so devoted to blaming American white people for slavery, especially in the South, it's worth mentioning that some of the first slaves introduced into America came here when a Dutch ship anchored off the coast of New Amsterdam, aka New York, in the 17th century with 11 slaves, and New York was next to last to abolish slavery in the northern states. Moreover, more than 42% of households in New York City had slaves by 1703. Let's also consider that when slaves were introduced into America, we were only a colony of the British Empire. So if the New York Times wants to blame white people for slavery, we have to start with the Brits and the citizens of New York. Maybe all the reparations for slavery demanded of American taxpayers by Black Lives Matter and the other radical leftists who are trying to divide and conquer us should be paid from the coffers of this state of New York. Wait, here's a better idea. Send the bill for reparations to King Charles at Buckingham Palace. Hey, you guys at the New York Times, here's his address, London SW1A10, UK. If that doesn't work, try the monarchs in the Netherlands, since it was a Dutch ship that brought slaves here. King Willem Alexander's address is Noordeinde Palace, Post Bus 30,412 2500 GK Den Haag, the Netherlands. Send him a bill. Let's all see what happens. My money says that these kings will tell you guys to stuff it where the sun don't shine. And of course, the Times and the rest of the left-wing propaganda machine wants to bloviate about these subjects constantly to continue convincing Black Americans and naive college pukes that they are still oppressed by white people. That racism is systemic in our culture, and blacks should always vote for Democrats who will give them reparations, welfare, and other freebies. It's pertinent to note that I've heard of the oxygen transport system, the solar system, telephone systems, and the Dewey Decimal System, but I've never heard of the racist system. So who is in charge of that one? Is there a cabinet post in state or federal government called the Secretary of Racism? Or is there a federal or private employer with the Department of Racism, even as a subpart of their Human Resources Department? Search out all the dark, dusty little corners of Washington, D.C. and see if you can find a think tank that will give you an address of where the racist system headquarters is located. What the left won't talk about, however, is how slavery was not limited to Africa or Africans, didn't get invented in 1619, and didn't end with the American Civil War. Slavery was practiced for thousands of years all over the globe before Africans were transplanted to America. It was the way the world worked at the time. Should we criticize and denigrate countries that had a feudal system? That's also the way the world rolled during a certain time of history, and the serfs were tantamount to slaves. Moreover, Africans not only were enslaved by other Africans first as a result of losing intertribal wars, but also by their own tribal kings who sold them to slavers. Not to be ignored, too, is that Arabs made a living off of slavery for centuries before slaves came to America. And yet Joe Biden and the Democrats have no problem doing business with the originators of slavery who profited by it centuries ago, or the Chinese who use slave labor today to undermine the world's prices of consumer goods. And this may be a shocker, but white people have been slaves, too. That includes white sailors of the American Navy. and American merchant ships that were captured off the coast of North Africa and ransomed or enslaved by Arabs just like the forefathers of African Americans. Since these Arabs were operating out of North Africa, that means white Americans were the slaves of Africans once upon a time. What would a leftist say about that? Enslaving white sailors and merchant seamen were acts that contributed to the Barbary Wars. Isn't that an interesting twist? People of color enslaving white people. So, Black Africans have no monopoly on being slaves or slaveholders, but are the only ones who seem to expect to profit from it today. As a matter of history, by the 1480s, before the discovery of America, the Portuguese were already transporting African slaves to various places in the eastern Atlantic. That was long before they brought them to America. Plenty of white European Christians were slaves, and anybody who ever read the Bible can find the history of Hebrews being enslaved by Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, and perhaps others off and on for centuries. Rome had slaves, the majority of which were white people, and in medieval Russia, white European slaves were treated the same as pre-Civil War Africans in America. E.g., the owner could work them, beat them, sell them or kill them, etc. The Vikings had slaves, and American Indians had slaves. Slaves existed in Africa, and the Ottoman Empire had hundreds of thousands of slaves with various levels and types of servitude, the majority of which were white people. Why did the Democrats and their useful idiots pick on white America who didn't have the monopoly on slavery? And why are they not berating all the other countries around the world for their history of slavery or calling them evil? Did they all get in the same chat room to develop a strategy to gain power, and this was all they could come up with? By now, you are becoming increasingly able to answer these questions. So, here's an afterthought. Should the descendants of the American sailors who were captured off the coast of North Africa over 200 years ago file a lawsuit to get reparations from Algeria, Tripoli, and others? Should the descendants of George Custer sue the descendants of Sitting Bull or the tribal councils of the Sioux Nation for reparations because they killed him at Little Big Horn? Should America sue England for reparations because the British burned the White House in 1814? I can just hear those folks laughing uncontrollably at the very thought. But the idea is about as ridiculous as American Negroes claiming a right to reparations for slavery when none of them have ever been a slave and no living white person in America has ever owned one. More appropriately, by legal standard, is there a requirement of law giving us a reparations predicate? No. Does Mexico owe us for wrecking the Alamo?